Hello and welcome to my new series where I'm going to be trying to make some popular, some games in Unity in just about an hour and see how far I can get. I got a little burnt out from my other projects. I kind of just need to do some marketing, honestly, so I'm hoping maybe this will help draw in a crowd. I can make some titles like Unity in under an hour. This guy makes this. So I want to make these videos more often, but if I spend a whole hour, I have to edit the whole hour and talk over it and whatnot. So this is going to be kind of weird format where I'm just going to ramble on. I'm going to watch the edited video that I kind of spliced together and talk over it, and then I'll edit it all together, and hopefully it'll look good. We'll see. But so the first game I decided to work on was the most stereotypical first game anyone ever works on, which is Flappy Bird. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video and see what happens. So obviously the first thing I'm doing here, which I'm probably going to cut out for future videos, is me creating the project in Unity. So the hardest part is getting a name for the project, of course, doing 2D, and I'm going to go ahead and while this is loading, I'm going to start gathering the art assets for the game, which I didn't even know. I kind of assumed would exist is something for Flappy Bird that Kenny made for the Kenny assets, and I did find something called Tappy Plane. So downloaded that. We skip ahead 3 minutes while it creates the project, of course, and I'm creating the file structure to house all the assets in the game. I go ahead and create an images folder and drag in those Kenny assets that I downloaded. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start selecting the assets I need. I haven't even really looked at these. No offense, Kenny, they're great, but I'm trying to do this in an hour, so I didn't do any preparation, so here we go. I grab the player, which will be a plane, and I grab the two little obstacles. I know in Flappy Bird they're like Mario pipes, but this definitely works. So I'm going to go ahead and basically create a prefab for them where I can just move them left and right or up and down to make them harder to get through. So I'm just scaling them out right now to try and get them look right, and I'm going to put them into one object. So what I can do is basically just copy the obstacle multiple times, paste it, and then move it from right to left, where, that's what the movement of Flappy Bird is. The player isn't actually moving, but the background around him is. So I create two scripts here, the player script and the game handler script. Player script is going to handle the plane movement, so we'll start with that. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a fake velocity. We don't need to use any crazy gravity function or anything. We're just going to increment it downwards, so you'll fall downwards over time. And if you hit the space bar, then the velocity instantly jumps up to 1. So let's see what that code does. Obviously, it doesn't do anything. My plane disappears, and it goes upwards because, I didn't make gravity go down. So I go ahead and put a negative sign there, velocity goes down. The second thing I have to fix is the speed. Everything's way too quick. Gravity's too fast, it instantly just teleports you to the bottom of the abyss. So after I tweak these numbers a little bit, lower them, here we go. This feels a little bit like Flappy Bird. I've slowed down everything here. So it pulls you down, but if you press space, it puts you back up for a little bit and puts it back down. So those are like 4 lines of code right there. We'll do that for you. Give you some fake gravity, velocity. Now I'm just playing around with the numbers to try and get it to feel a little better, so the gravity's not so heavy, and so you aren't so floaty. So I went ahead and did that. The next thing I want to work on is the rotation, which I definitely skipped because I have no idea how to do as of right now. The rotation is just a polish where if you go upwards, you tilt upwards, and if you're falling down, you tilt downwards. And now what I'm doing at this point is I'm going to work on the obstacles. So I spent, I believe, 10 minutes or so figuring out how to get a collider based on a sprite, which I figure out happens automatically, of course, by adding polygon colliders. So I'm Googling my way to victory here. Unity documentation's amazing. I'm setting up my colliding logic for the player when they run into the wall. And at this point, I'm going to jump into the obstacle logic. where I'm going to start coding how the obstacles are spawned and moved and whatnot. So the best way to do this would, of course, be to have some sort of object pooling going on, but I'm doing it very quick and lazily, so I'm just going to create a list of them, and as they go off screen, I will delete them. And every, I think, 2 seconds I'll make a new one, so they'll just infinitely be spawning and being despawned every so often. So what we do is we grab the base obstacle, save it for later, and then create containers in a list, basically. So now we're going to be moving all of the obstacles that are spawned to the left. Very simple code there. We're just going through all of the obstacles in that list, moving them to the left, multiplied by delta time, so we don't get any lagginess. And now I just created the spawning logic, and at this point I'm finding the bounds of the level, I guess. So like I'm trying to find how high up the obstacles can go and how far down they can go, and how far to the left and right they can go before they get off screen. So I just created a random range there, so they will spawn higher or lower. So some of them will spawn up high and some of them will spawn down low, so you'll have to, maneuver your way through them. And now I'm putting in the code to delete it. So every time an obstacle is to the left at that coordinate, the negative 12.4 for their x coordinate, then it'll be deleted. And I believe I put every 2 seconds at the top there, a new object will be created. And nothing was happening at first, of course, because I didn't re-enable the game objects. So now we saw there, they were not spawning fast enough, or they weren't moving fast enough, I think was the issue. So yeah, we went ahead and increased the spawns, or the movement speed of those obstacles. And there we go, it's looking a little better. And now we're trying to work on the collisions, and I'm noticing in the console that the debug log that should say collision happened is not happening on collision enter. So I'm like, what's going on? What the heck? So I changed the player into a trigger because I don't want the player to like collide into the walls, which honestly doesn't matter in the end. I figured that out, but in my head I'm like, okay, I don't want them to mess up the colliders here. So. And after a certain amount of time, I figure out, of course, I need to add rigid bodies to everything. So I add rigid bodies to the obstacles and to the player. I'm playing around with the is trigger, the gravity is freaking out. I'm having things fly around everywhere. I'm physically knocking into the walls now and messing them up, which is totally fine. I'm getting some log messages. I'm kind of just playing around to see how I can get this working properly. Everything's touching each other, and finally, all I do to end the game when you hit a wall is I just set the time scale to 0 so it pauses. Of course, I think in the real game it does like a circle around the player or an X or something wherever you collide, but I don't think I get to that in the hour I am given. So I'm trying to do the rotation now. I kind of just write down the cases and get it working in my head, and I figure out I can just use the rigid body rotation components to get the rotation the way I want. However, if you look at the code I've mixed up, for that clamp function is supposed to be negative 1.5 and 1.5. I mixed them up, so I mixed up the max and min, so it wasn't working. I also found out that I should have been multiplying my transform position movements by delta time, so I messed up the time scaling, so I have to go on and play around with that again to get that working. I figure out that I mixed up the negatives there, and now I feel a little artsy and I'm running out of time, so I'm like, let me try to do some parallax in here, maybe parallax scrolling. I decided that takes too much time and ultimately scrap it, and this of course doesn't mesh very well in my opinion, so I immediately get rid of that. But you can see the rotation for the player is working, which is nice. It's just a little crazy, so I changed that number down a little bit, and this is what it looks like. You see, we get a little rotation with the velocity. Gives it just a little game feel, game juice. I run into the side there and it pauses the game. So now I'm playing out with the numbers. And at this point, I'm going to start the score UI. So I import TextMesh Pro. I use one of Kenny's UI assets here, and I do some, Unity UI magic here. AKA I'm terrible at Unity's UI system, and I get this looking somewhat okay. Of course, using the default font because I'm evil. Got the score working. And now what we want to do is be able to increment the score. So I don't do anything too crazy here. I just put basically a third object in every obstacle that's going to spawn. It's basically, think of it as a finish line, where once you cross over that, it also has a collider on it, and it'll just increment the score. So here's where I create the score logic. So a variable to hold the score. And I also work on a function to restart the game quickly. Since I'm going to be resetting the score, I figured I'd work on that function. Gather the player because we want to reset their position on game restart. So we find out the exact coordinates where we want them to spawn, put them there, reset the score, remove the obstacles, of course, just by iterating through them backwards so we don't mess up the list. There we go. We call it at the game start. Don't want any null reference exceptions, put that there. And now what we want to do is if we hit the jump key when the game's over, which we can basically tell just seeing if the time scale is 0 or not, we don't have a like bool for that or anything. We can reset the game. So we're creating the add score function, very simple, where you're just incrementing the score by 1 and then updating the text mesh, which we are grabbing right now in the start function. You can then increment that, set that to 0 when you start the game, of course. I'll use a nice string literal here, or string formatting, whatever that's called. You need a singleton, very ugly singleton, to the game handler to call the reset function. And then when you run over the finish lines, basically, it'll increment the score. So at this point, something's fucked up. Look at that, doesn't look right. So I figure out that I need to set the goal to trigger because it was touching the obstacles and messing them up. And here we go, I ran into the wall and it paused it, but the score is still not working. And of course, since I just changed that goal to a trigger, I need a separate function to detect triggers versus collisions, or non-triggers. Now when we test it, I run past, and here we go. The score should, oh, just kidding. So it turns out I didn't do it right because the collider wasn't actually a proper collider, I believe. Yeah, so I was using a polygon collider for something that didn't have a sprite, so it didn't know how to make the collider. So I just changed that to a box collider, and it had the proper bounds. The last thing I want to do is, of course, last minute, is just check if you're too high or low. Basically, just if you're too low, you're dead, right? Because you fell and you're dead. But if you're too high, I'm not going to kill you. I'm just going to say you can't use your input. And here we go. So you fall, you can reset, you go too high, you just can't press it anymore, so you get stuck there. I even try to jump over the top here just to see if it's like, you can break it, but you can't. So now I'm just doing a test, and this is it. So I gave myself an hour. Things I wanted to add, of course, were sounds and particle systems maybe, and of course some better graphics. I mean, nothing, I was going to use Kenny assets, but there is a background graphic I didn't even see because I was going too quick. Very nice trail particle system would be, I think, a good addition for the plane, like some smoke at the end that just stays for a bit, maybe a puff of smoke when you jump. Of course, maybe just some simple music and jumping sound effects, score sound effect, and maybe even adding some pickups that spawn randomly that you can try and grab, like a little star that'll give you some extra points. Main menu, pause menu, of course, those are always great. Some more UI. But I got most of it working within an hour. I mean, the whole game logic works. I even got a restart, which I'm proud of myself for doing. I don't know what the next game will be. I do want to do this at least once a week. I did want to do this every day, but the editing for this would take too long. It's already taking like 3 hours to get this done. And I work, so I can't just work and then do this. It's painful. So I'm just playing around with the graphics, trying to see if, I mean, the hour's up, we won't count it, right? But I figured I'd try and see what I can make this look like. And I mean, this looks a little nicer, I guess, maybe a little saturated, but that's Flappy Bird, you know, the most stereotypical game you can make. Maybe I'll get some views on this. I'd appreciate it if any of you guys watch this to, of course, subscribe and whatnot. You know, I gotta say that spiel because it really does help. And I got some games out there too, actually, on the Steam store. Check my YouTube page if you're interested to support me. And thank you. I will be back with some more videos in the future.